And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us, and one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it, and that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tells. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight we're going to be joined by my guest, Rissa. Rissa is a tour guide for some of the haunted locations in Maryland and some in Pennsylvania. She reached out to me a while back and we got something scheduled. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking with her. Before we bring Rissa on, if you've ever had an experience and you would like to be on an episode of Tinfoil Tells, there's a couple things you can do. You can either send an email to tinfoiltellspodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to tinfoiltells.com and go to the contact section. Either way works for me, so just make sure to reach out and we will get something scheduled for a future episode. If you would like to podcast out, please continue to share it around. Word of mouth is the best way of getting the word out for the podcast. You can also help out by leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts at. So if you're on Apple or Spotify, just click the 5 stars and it definitely does help out. So please continue to do that if you haven't already. You can also join the Patreon, become a member. There's different tiers. There's the free membership and the paid membership. You get access to some of the episodes on the free membership. But with the paid membership, you get access to all of the episodes, early access to the new ones. They're all ad-free. It's only $1.99 a month, so it's worth checking out. You can find more information about that in the show notes. Make sure to follow me around on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, X. But we're going to go ahead now and bring Rissa on to dive into the conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time to welcome my guest tonight, Rissa. Thanks for coming on here and talking to me.
Thank you so much for having me, Brandon. I'm delighted to be here.
Would you like to let the audience know a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I work as a ghost tour guide. I work in both Pennsylvania and Maryland, and I tell haunted history and ghost stories as a big part of my living. So I always tell people that I work in the paranormal field, but I lean more into being a historian than an investigator. They do go hand in hand, but I mean, it's definitely it's a lot of shades of gray in between those two.
Mm-hmm.
But I do a lot of history research about my buildings, about who the ghosts could have been, if they were in fact related to the story of a building or a town. And it's definitely been a thing that I've found a lot of excitement trying to figure out who the hauntings might be. Now, sometimes that's not the case. I do work with other people as well. I sometimes work with psychics and they'll tell me like, this ghost isn't related to the building they're walking. And so in those cases, it's kind of, anything goes. But a lot of times I'm able to find obituaries or articles or things about the ghost stories that I tell. And it's really cool to put a face to history. And, as far as how the hauntings themselves react to that, I like to think that they must really like that somebody has taken the time to figure out who they were and what their story was and to tell it continuously in their memory.
I've always been interested in paranormal, like hauntings and places that it could be haunted or whatever, but I've only been on a couple different investigations with local groups or whatever, and it kind of soured me on the whole thing. But there's certain places that I would love to go, but then I'm like, I've done this show enough and I've listened to enough stuff and talked to enough people that it's like, I'm afraid to go to these places now because I'm afraid I'm going to like bring something back with me.
Well, I haven't found it to be super common, at least not for me. And I go in and out of haunted spaces every day. I have not had a lot of tag-alongs. I have not had a lot of attachments. Once in my life I did, but like I said, I've worked in this field a long time. I wouldn't call myself a medium per se, but I am sensitive enough to know what's going on around me usually. And I don't find that I walk people through haunted spaces all the time. I don't run into a lot of attachments. Now, if you go into a space that's full of malevolent energy, or there's been a lot of, pain and suffering, like an old hospital, you might have a different story there. I worked with paranormal investigative teams, and some of them have been wonderful and sensitive people who really cared a lot about what was going on, and both the spirits and the participants. And then I've worked with others who were less professional, I guess you could say. There was one team that I worked with. Unfortunately, most of them were intoxicated the whole time. They were banging on the walls. They were yelling at ghosts. They were yelling at participants. It was just a bad scene. So in that case, I could see how you might have been soured. I was soured on that particular group. I just simply won't ever work with them again. But I have found other individuals that, I'd encourage you to, consider somebody else who has a different philosophy when you feel ready, because there are some investigators out there who are good people and are working with ethical considerations in mind.
I've talked to a few of the locals now since I've been doing the show, and I wouldn't be opposed to going out with them at some point, but this was about 15 years ago, and everything was paranormal. And it didn't matter what it could have possibly been explained as. Everything was a ghost, a ghost, a ghost. So I'm just like, I'm more of a skeptical type of a person in general, so I'm not going to say everything is paranormal right off the bat.
Oh, I absolutely agree. So many times I have had people reach out to me, say, like, can you help me figure out what's going on in my house? Sometimes there's, a raccoon in the attic, or there's a malfunctioning HVAC system, or a dishwasher that's squeaking. And all of those things really do need to be considered before you immediately land on ghost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always try and look at things in a scientific, explainable, sort of rational explanations before I jump to otherworldly explanations, I guess.
I'm the same way. I think that you have to consider the mundane first.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time it's not a ghost. Sometimes it is unexplainable. I've had people show me video that I cannot explain. Things like glasses floating through the air, things like that. In a restaurant, I can't explain that. It doesn't look like a draft could do it. But an entity certainly could. It's moments like that where I'm like, well, you probably have something paranormal here. But when it's something like a squeaky sound on the stairs, I'm like, it could just be that you have a squeaky staircase that, needs some refinishing.
Yep. That's kind of how I try and look at things too. I did have a question though, like, what led you on to become a tour guide? Like, how did you come about doing that?
That's a great question. So when I was 8 years old, I was in England with my mom and dad, and I grew up in a town called York, Pennsylvania. And we were in a place called York, England. And if you've never heard of York, England, you should check it out. It is considered the most haunted part of England, even more so than London per capita. And when I was 8 years old, they took me on a ghost tour, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Now, to be honest, ghost tours are not usually recommended for 8-year-olds, but I was already a dark and spooky Wednesday Addams type, and I absolutely fell in love with the entire experience. And I wasn't old enough at 8 to become a tour guide, but at 15 I was. And, I had to overcome being an introvert and being incredibly shy to become a tour guide. But I wanted to do it bad enough that I decided this is just how I was going to learn to get past being shy. And I did. I became a tour guide when I was 15. I worked for the local historical society, and I was a guide in, I think, like 4 or 5 different buildings that they offered tours for. I really ended up loving the process of talking about history and sharing stories of the past. I didn't become a ghost tour guide till much later. For the most part, you have to be 21 to do that because of pub crawls. So, which is fair. But I was a tour guide many places in the course of my life, college, different historical properties, different museums. And later, when I became finally a ghost tour guide, I worked at Maryland History Tours. I still work there. And I absolutely finally was like, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I love putting this kind of a face on history and telling the stories of the past in a way that gives them a personality.
It's I've never been on an actual tour. Like,
Oh, well, you should check one out sometime when you run across it. Maybe when you're traveling.
that doesn't seem to happen too much. My life's too chaotic with that way. I have 4 kids, married, and a full-time job and everything else. So the travel doesn't seem to happen as much as you would think it would be, but I enjoy what I do, so I wouldn't change my life. So maybe when my kids are older, I'll get to travel.
Maybe one day you can all go enjoy a tour together somewhere.
I think I'm the only one in my family that enjoys some of the stuff that I do, though. So I don't know if I could get them to go on a haunted thing. So I can't even get them to go to the little scary haunted house things that we have around here. As we kind of talked about off air, I think everyone's afraid of the dark except for me. So I'm the oddball of the family.
Yeah, it is true. Most of the ghost tours do happen at night.
Mm-hmm.
So you are walking around usually by candlelight or lantern light, something like that.
So I don't know if I would do great in certain situations. This is completely off topic or whatever, but when I mentioned the haunted stuff, this was years ago. We had a local haunted jail, but they had people in costumes, and I saw someone come around the corner, so I knew he was going to jump out, but I was not expecting the other person to come out from the other side. And my fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I'm pretty sure I punched the kid in the nose. And when it was all said and done, when we got outside, I apologized to him. He's like, "It's okay." I was like, his nose was bloody. I was like, "Oh, poor guy." I wasn't expecting it, but he startled me, and I just popped him.
Well, years ago, I was in a commercial haunt like that, and the devil came out after me, and he had a plastic pitchfork. And just as he was, menacingly poking his pitchfork towards me, it fell apart. So it wasn't nearly as terrifying as it might have been had his pitchfork not literally fallen apart. But when I do, there's nobody who jumps out or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more like a walking tour, and we stop in front of historic buildings. Sometimes we get to go in them. It depends on the program, but it's a lot calmer and quieter. And I've never been on a haunted tour that does the jump scares, but sometimes the real ghosts make an appearance, which is pretty interesting and exciting. I even have photographs from some of my guest tours, both in Maryland and Pennsylvania, of mysterious faces in windows or things that they couldn't have photoshopped because they shot them right there. So it's interesting when at a ghost tour, a ghost actually shows up.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to talk about, far as like your personal experiences, before we dive into some of the things you've experienced while doing the tours?
I would be happy to. So my first, so I was definitely one of those little kids that interacted with ghosts, and my parents were extremely accepting, and they never told me it was an imaginary friend. They always just said, "You probably shouldn't tell others, but it's fine if you see ghosts. We believe you. It's all good." And so I went about my business thinking that ghosts were real, and that sometimes they showed up and talked to me, or I could even see them. And my first time I saw a full body apparition, I was again in England, and it was in York, England, at a restaurant called Marmaduke's. The restaurant is something different now, but it is still there, and it is still an Italian restaurant. And Marmaduke Buckle was a real person in England's history. Sadly, he was a person who we would now say had some both physical and mental challenges. But when he lived in the 1600s, it unfortunately got confused with witchcraft, as so often happened in the past. And he was driven, sadly, to end his own life. Now, when I saw him in the restaurant, I had gone up to use the bathroom, and I just saw a really sad young man who I would have put like as a teenager in one of the rooms. And he looked so sad that I went back downstairs and got my mom. I said, Mom, come upstairs. There's a boy that needs help. And we got upstairs and there was nobody. Now, I hadn't seen anybody follow me down the steps, and he certainly hadn't gone into the bathroom because the bathroom doors were both open, and it's a small place. And my mom went down and got one of the servers, and the server's like, oh, you saw the ghost. That's the room where Marmaduke appears. And so that was the first time in my young life that I remember seeing a full body apparition, and I remember seeing a facial expression, like the very detailed experience. And I wasn't scared. In fact, I mostly just felt sad. I did not know the story of Marmaduke Buckle when I saw his apparition. I learned the story later. And luckily, because I was an 8-year-old, the server said that sometimes he appears as he was when he hanged himself. But luckily, I did not see that. I just saw him sitting on a chair, and he was very sad. And I could sort of empathize with him as a little girl seeing the apparition. Like I said, I'm really glad that he did not appear to me, as he sometimes allegedly does. So that was my first really memorable experience with a really distinct ghost. And since then, like throughout my life, there have been numerous encounters everywhere I've ever lived that I could only account to a ghost. Sometimes things are moving by themselves, or sometimes it's just I'm almost sure there's a ghost in the room. I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. And if I can't prove it, I don't usually talk about it. I just kind of let it go. But I've had very interesting experiences on ghost tours that were public and in front of a lot of people. And they always seem to happen at particular sites. So is it good for me to transition into that now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So in Ellicott City, Maryland, where I give ghost tours, there is a place called the B&O Railroad. It was America's first passenger rail station, and it connected Ellicott City, Maryland to Baltimore by 13 miles of track. And at that station, there's a ghost named Charlie. Charlie was the station master there. He and his family lived in the station, which used to be a customary thing. And he was there during the time of the Civil War. He is a real person, or he was a real person. And a lot of people have experiences with Charlie. When there's nobody upstairs, they hear footsteps. Sometimes Charlie is helpful enough to move the trash cans on trash day. And when none of the employees have done so. And they still hear luggage being dragged across the floor in the second floor. So I was giving a presentation. The whole second floor of the rail station is now one great big empty room. And a lot of times they do history lectures there. And I was giving a talk there about Edgar Allan Poe. I had not mentioned Charlie to any of the people there. It was a night where we were talking about something totally different. And it didn't even occur to me that it would bother Charlie that I hadn't told his story. So I was going on talking about my topic, and two women who did not know each other, did not come together, both stood up and screamed and said someone had touched them at the same time. Now they were like one in front of each other, one in front and one behind. And they both felt an icy cold man's hand reach down and grasp their shoulder. And I immediately was like, oh, that's just Charlie. He just wants us to know that he's here. The women did not take it in stride like I did. They both hustled right out of the lecture. And there was nothing about Mr. Poe that was going to keep them there that night. But I did immediately stop and tell Charlie's story and acknowledge that we were in his place. And there was no more incident that night from Charlie at the B&O. So there are a lot of interesting photographs that come in from tours at a particular window where they used to hang the lantern. in the old rail station, sometimes there's a face there as well as the reflection of the lantern. And it's a museum. It's closed after 5 o'clock. So it's not like there's a person in there. But again, we can't quite explain the pictures. We can't explain them, and we can't explain them away. And we get a few every year and tours run there all the time. So it is interesting that Charlie would choose to stick around. He didn't have a particularly traumatic or awful life. He had a pretty normal life for his time. And he was a pivotal part of getting Union forces to the West during the Civil War, because he and some guards kept that train station from ever falling into the Confederate hands. So he had an interesting role in history, like one of those tiny turn pins that nobody really thinks about, but was important. And he kept the tracks between DC and Points West open and safe for the Union. So all of that said, they still think of him as a very active spirit, but not unfriendly. He's just there and still doing his thing, taking care of the station, even though it's been a museum for a very long time. And I believe 1950 was when they had their last commercial train come through that station. But there's another spot further up the hill in Ellicott City called the Wine Bin, and it's a wine shop now. But it was originally the old firehouse. And Captain Benjamin Shipley was the first fire station master there. And it was the first firehouse that had trucks. Before that, it was like the horses, right? So they had trucks, and he believed in having an open door policy. And when the liquor store moved in, years after it was no longer a fire station, there was a lot of trouble with that, because the folks who ran the liquor store knew that they locked the doors at night. They knew it. He put in cameras to prove that he locked the doors at night. Well, somehow they would come in the morning and the doors would be open, including the door to the back of the room where there was a safe. So they also caught things on camera, like stuff being rearranged mysteriously. I guess Captain Shipley, who did both live and die at that firehouse, just decided that he didn't like how things looked, and maybe he was going to move it around. Dogs go crazy in this place, and they are always very cognizant. When they had a paranormal investigative team in, they said that both Captain Shipley and his firehouse dog, his Dalmatian, whose name was Yogi, are both still there. And they say that the living dogs, are reacting to Yogi. So all of that said, I was giving a talk there. They have an open space in the back, and it was not about the captain. It was not about the firehouse, and it was not even about ghosts. It was a different history topic for the city. And there were a lot of people standing there listening to me chat, when all of a sudden, bottles started tipping off the shelf right behind me. There was no breeze. There was nothing that should have knocked them down. But suddenly, this is a water bottle in my hand as I show you. I'm trying to demonstrate. I know there's no camera on your podcast. But they just started tipping right off the shelf. Bottles of wine crashing, smashing to the floor. Just one at a time. Boop, boop, boop. And then behind me, there was a case with beer, and the beer started literally tipping out of the display onto the floor. I immediately stopped what I was talking about. I pushed everybody back so nobody got hurt on all the broken glass. And I said, I'm so sorry, Captain. I meant to tell your story first. And let's proceed with telling the story of this old firehouse and the captain and his dog. And the minute I started telling it, all of the activity stopped. So there was nothing rumbling. There was no truck driving by. There was no reason the thing should have fallen and started breaking only where I was standing. All we could think of was that it was Captain Shipley. Everybody wanted to leave at that point. Also, everybody was kind of like, we should leave. And I believe that the employees were like, we need to clean up, so you all need to clear out. And we did. We went on to the next part of the pub crawl. And there's another super haunted site in Ellicott City. It used to be a church, and now it's another museum. And one time I was giving a totally different talk, and it was not a cold. It was not cold in the church. It wasn't. This shouldn't have happened. The heat was set. It was the fall, and the heat was set, I believe, at 72. Everybody was comfortable. And then all of a sudden, right into the middle of the room, this cold column. The people in the middle of the room could see their breath. It went from being normal to so cold that you could see your breath, including where I was standing talking and like the very middle of the audience in the front. I stopped. I told the history of the building. I told the ghost stories of the building. There were quite a few. And we all started to warm up again. But it was that cold that you could see your breath. I mean, it was a drop of maybe, where is it the point when you see your breath? Isn't it like 40 something?
It's around there.
It was dramatic that it happened in seconds and then cleared out in seconds. So now when I'm going to give lectures at that museum, I always go in first. And I'm like, hey, I'm here tonight. I'm not here to talk about you all, but I'm going to introduce you. And we're going to be talking about, whatever other part of history tonight. But I know you're here. I acknowledge you. And I will introduce you before we begin our talk. So, because that was a super weird experience. And people were really uncomfortable with it. Nobody got up and left on me at that point, which was lovely. But I was free. I was suddenly like shaking cold. It was so strange. And a lot of folks have had experiences in that museum. Things like they've had tour groups of children from schools. And apparently once there was a really, how do I say this? Not super well-behaved young man who was picking on other kids. And all of a sudden he felt a slap across the face. And as you know, we don't discipline children that way. But it doesn't mean somebody from the past wouldn't have. But he had a handprint right there, as if somebody had slapped him. And he did not blame any of the other students. Everybody who was there at that time said that it came out of nowhere. Like, he just got slapped by nothing. And so we don't have film or camera on that one. But there were witnesses that there was nobody there to hit him. And he was just suddenly slapped. So maybe one of the old church ladies had enough of his attitude.
Maybe.
So we'll never know for sure, but I'm sure he'll remember it for the rest of his life.
Now, when it comes to some of these experiences that everyone else is experiencing, have you ever had anyone that's trying to claim it's not real as they're there?
Oh, sure. Ghost tours are appealing to all sorts of people. It isn't just believers that go on them. There are people who just love history, or they're traveling through an area and they want to know more about it. On every single tour, I would say I have both believers and skeptics, and that's totally fine. I'm completely open to both. And I think that there's space for both in an experience like a ghost tour. There's also people who go on a ghost tour because they want to have an experience. And sometimes I think they like push too hard. Sometimes They do things like literally trespass on private property. And I'm like, I really can't have you walking on somebody's lawn or like up to their front door. Like, you need to pull back. Do you know what the show Supernatural is?
Yes.
I had two young men show up one time dressed like Sam and Dean. And they were literally telling me that they were going to like find some ghosts. And I was like, great, but I need you to keep it under control. More than once that night on that tour, I had to pull them back from trespassing on people's private property. Not a museum, but like somebody's actual home. They're like walking up, looking in the windows. I'm like, all right, come on, boys, back it up. You're not looking for ghosts. You're literally illegally trespassing on somebody's front porch.
Being creepers at this point.
Yeah, that exactly. Never trust the living.
Right.
But that said, I think there are folks that definitely would try to take any one of these stories I just told you and explain it in some rational way. I chose those specifically because I could never explain them. There are times when so I've had people like standing in an old church with me, and they're right next to a drafty window made of glass that's over 100 years old. And they're like, there's a cold spot here. I'm like, you're right. And it's a drafty window. But like the cold spot in the church was experienced by a whole group of people. And I couldn't explain it with electronics. There was no way that a heater, especially in an old drafty church, worked like that. And I knew the museum. I knew that's not where the drafts were. So I couldn't explain it away. None of the staff could explain it away. The HVAC was working fine. There was no reason it should have gotten cold in just that one place.
Mm-hmm.
Not like standing next to a drafty window where if you weren't cold, I would wonder why not. So yeah, absolutely. There are people who, even when they witness it, like the two women, there were people like, do you think that really happened? I'm like, I think that they believe it really happened. You know, I was like, Charlie didn't touch my shoulder. I didn't have a strange icy hand touch me. So I can't explain to you what they felt. But, you know, I believe that they experienced something that made them so upset that they had to leave.
I've often wondered, though, if people come in there with those expectations, if they don't manifest these things to happen sometimes.
It could be, but in all of the examples I've given you, nobody was there for a ghost tour. They were all there for Edgar Allan Poe lecture or some other piece of history.
Okay. Yeah, because
sadly, on a ghost tour, for the most part, sometimes the ghosts show up. Other times they don't. So sometimes it's an experience that just one or two people have. But the ones I gave you, I tried to pick ones where there was a big audience who all saw something and they weren't there specifically looking for ghosts.
Yeah, because I don't understand that side of the paranormal. Obviously, I don't think anyone really does, but like,
no, nobody does.
I feel like there's a large group of people. Maybe it's the energy of all those people that can, I don't want to say feed them, but cause them to manifest.
That's a possibility.
But at the same time, then there's instances where it just happens to one person. So
right. Well, you know, it's like I said, a lot of folks show up on a ghost tour, and there's so many reasons people come. But there are definitely people who come because they want to have that experience. They want to have some kind of supernatural or paranormal encounter. And I can't promise that ever. Nobody can. But if they have it, sometimes they have it alone. You know, like they're sure that they saw a face in a window. And I'm like, that's a museum. It's closed. There's nobody there. You know?
Yeah.
So did they see something? I'll never know. I'm sure that, you know, I always believe people when they tell me they experienced something, especially if they are also showing signs of trauma. And then other people show up on a ghost tour because they've already had a paranormal experience somewhere else and nobody believes them. And they kind of just want to be heard with compassion. I am always willing to stand in that place and listen with compassion. And in my many years doing ghost tours, I have heard ghost stories. I have heard cryptid stories. I have heard UFO stories. Because all of these folks that are having these experiences, whether they can be explained or not, are just looking for someone to hear them without judgment. And I'm always willing to do that. And sometimes people ask me like, what should I do? Or what does it mean? I'm like, I don't know what you should do. I don't know what it means, but I'm happy to listen.
You're essentially me without the podcast.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why I do what I do, is to give a place for people to talk about the weird experiences they can't really talk about normally because people are going to think you're crazy.
Yeah. But yeah, I won't tell them they're crazy. I won't try to explain it away. I will always listen with patience and compassion. There are times when I'm still standing at the end of my tour, 30, 40 minutes after it's over, because people are sharing things with me that have happened in their life that they don't have a place for and they can't make sense of it. I'm always brought back to people. There are people who their world is just tilted, and they don't know how to rationalize or understand something they experienced. And I can't necessarily fix that for them, but I'm always willing to listen.
Yep, that's basically what I try to do here. It's just to give people the platform to have the opportunity to talk, because a lot of the times all they need is to just talk about it, and it somehow works therapeutically for some people. Some people have had this built up and bottled up for so many years, they just have to talk to somebody.
Oh yes, I have run across that too. People who have been sitting on an experience for years, and their spouse didn't believe them, their grown children didn't believe them, their colleagues, their neighbors, whoever, nobody believed them, or they said, you're literally crazy. And I'm like, I don't think you're crazy. I think there are things in the world we don't understand, but I can't tell you what it means.
Right. I think it also takes someone, and I just say this, I'm not an expert or anything, but I feel like it takes someone that's actually had some sort of an experience to understand what someone else is actually going through too. Because you can tell someone this has happened, and if they've never had any sort of weird experience, they can't relate to it. And
Exactly.
not everyone can relate to the same traumatic experiences other people have had, but if you've had some sort of an actual experience, you can somewhat relate a little bit of at least understanding that this is strange.
Hmm.
This is I've experienced something that is unexplainable, so I kind of can relate to how you can be experiencing something too. It might not be the same thing, but at least we're on the same wavelength.
Absolutely. I when I was training, when I was moving from doing just regular history into doing haunted history, it's not something that anybody prepared me for. And I'm just used to like talking about history on tours or at lectures, and that was it. Some people might walk up and like be like, "Oh, that was very cool," or "Oh, I also have a vase like that," or whatever. But when you step into the paranormal world, you're stepping into a space that nobody understands, that nobody can explain, that science can't disprove or prove. And there's all of this gray area. There's just like a whole lot of space where there's uncertainty, and that makes people who have these experiences really uncomfortable. It's interesting to me too, because a lot of other cultures see the paranormal very differently than Americans do. And like, for example, I recently attended a lecture by a fellow from Scotland. And in Scotland, they have experts, sometimes a family line, whose their whole expertise is in dealing with hauntings. And this is a respected thing to do. And it was just absolutely fascinating to me to listen to this man talk about his family's experiences. They call it laying ghosts, meaning putting them to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not thought of in the same way here. We don't have experts in various towns that are there to deal with people's haunted homes. And it's just not a thing. But there, it's normal, and it's talked about more openly. And then I guess in many other cultures around the world, there are festivals where they celebrate the ghosts and the dead. We have Dia de los Muertos, we have the Hungry Ghost Festival. I mean, all of these other places and other cultures have a space for ghosts, where ghosts can be acknowledged, where these things can be believed in their own way, and ancestors and those who are dead can be honored in a very specific way. Our culture doesn't do that. I mean, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that we don't have a space for it. So I think that adds to the pile of stuff that people who have paranormal experiences have to deal with. The fact that we don't have a language or a space for it in our American culture, aside from like horror movies.
Do you have an opinion? I know it's an opinion that everyone has one, but like, what do you think a lot of the paranormal experiences actually are? Do you think these are residual hauntings? Do you think these are spirits, or do you think that's could possibly be something else?
Both. I think residuals are real. So many people have the same experience of the same ghost, and they don't know each other. I think that residuals are like a scar on time space. They'll never change. They're always the same. Like I have a scar here on my hand where I put a curling iron on my skin. It's always going to look the same. I think residuals are the exact same. And I think there are a lot of residuals. I think the idea of laying an energy imprint on a space makes sense. There's a lot of discussion about how that could happen, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a geologist. I can't explain those things. I have talked to physicists and geologists, and it's interesting when they're taken off the record. They'll say, we can't prove that it's not true. I actually spoke to a geologist recently, a PhD, and he's like, I think there are certain stones that do hold energy. He's like, there are certain stones that when I get around them, I immediately get a headache. He's like, I can't prove why or that's happening. He's like, so how am I to prove to you without a shadow of a doubt that it's impossible that ghosts are related to bedrock. He's like, I can't prove to you that it's impossible. He's like, it could be possible. It could just be beyond the science we have now. So that's what I think about residuals. As far as interactives, do I believe they are souls or spirits? I guess then the short answer is yes. I can't explain to you what the afterlife is. My opinion is that souls are made of energy. Energy is another word for a soul in lots of other languages and in other concepts like chi or ki. That's the soul. It's the energy that keeps you alive. It's the energy that makes me alive and this plastic cup not alive, you know? So without my body, am I still alive? I don't know, maybe. I'll let you know when I get there. But again, it's something that you can't disprove. And I've had enough encounters myself that I can't explain that I think there's something to it. My opinion is that there could in fact be, I mean, maybe it's the theory that Einstein had, that there are multiple dimensions and we just travel from one to the next, you know? I don't know. I mean, that kind of makes sense.
So that's kind of the route that I've been saying lately with my own opinion is, what if a lot of the paranormal stuff that we think is ghost is something from a different realm just bleeding into our world? So when people see shadow people, or if they see these things, what if this is just normal for them and they're already there? It's just their reality, their different dimension is bleeding into ours.
I think that's a possibility. And again, I don't know that we have the science to understand that at this point. So
that's where I've always tried to go with it. Like, there's just say there's a spirit realm, like a different dimension that is like the spirit side. Like maybe when we die here in the 3D world, maybe our energy, our spirit, or whatever you want to call it, goes on to the next plane of existence. And then, not throwing out religion of any type of form, but whatever we move on to next is the next plane that sometimes interacts with the existing one now.
I'm very much on the same page as you. And I think that's definitely a possibility. Again, I can't prove it or disprove it with science. I can't prove it or disprove it with religion either. But nobody else can either.
Right.
And I think for people who've had experiences like this, especially people who've experienced like an ongoing haunting, the trauma is real. Like any therapist would look at them and say, whatever happened, they experienced a real trauma. And I definitely have run across that with people who I've met who have had especially cryptid and UFO experiences.
Yeah.
I would say that their trauma is extremely real. I'm not a therapist. That's not what I do for a living. But I know somebody who's traumatized when I see it. And I've talked to people who were so knocked sideways by experiences they couldn't explain. By seeing, you know, what they think might have been a werewolf walk out of the woods and pass in front of their car. Or I actually interviewed someone whose sister had so many UFO experiences that she finally committed suicide because she didn't want to live anymore. So it's like, those are real. Those things are very real. And those people have experienced something that... Well, in the case of the young lady who decided to take her life, it was so traumatizing that she didn't want to continue. So I can't explain those things, but I also think they should be taken seriously when people say them, and you shouldn't be told you're crazy, or you shouldn't be told you imagine that. It's real to that person. And I feel like that some modicum of respect is in order.
You said you interviewed people. Do you have your own
I don't have a podcast or anything.
Okay.
I was collecting stories for a book.
Okay, because when you said that, I was like, I didn't know if you had your own show or not. But...
Nope. I'm working on a book about the town where I grew up, York, Pennsylvania. I also lead ghost tours there, and I really just wanted to collect a lot of people's stories. And I found that the more people I asked, the more stories just fell out of all different kinds, things I never would have expected. And like someone who has a terrifying hairy elf that they think lives in their house. Is it real? I don't know, but she's certainly terrified of it. And again, I don't know what it could be. It be something from another realm. She thinks it's a Pukwudgie, which is like an Algonquian legend, and I don't know anything about them. They're not my area of expertise. I know that people have looked for them in Massachusetts and New York and places like that. But this woman is convinced she has one in Pennsylvania, and it breaks things in her house. And she goes into her kitchen and finds somebody's taken a bite out of food, and there's nobody home but her. And I don't know what to tell her it is.
A lot of people would relate that to fae folk too.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is a lot of stories about, I say fae, but to most people, when you say fairy, they understand it. But
Right.
they think of Tinkerbell. I was like, nah, it's not really
No,
that.
that's a Disney story.
Yeah, it's not that, but the fae is definitely prevalent in a lot of lore, especially over in Europe too.
Oh, definitely. Very old lore.
Mm-hmm. Which again, legends and stories are influenced by something.
They are. You know, I think it's interesting. I mentioned werewolves earlier. Werewolves are one of the things I've researched as a historian. They go back, creatures go back to every continent where there were people. They weren't all wolves. Some of them were cats or other animals, but a were creature goes back to over 3000 BC. And that we know of, because we didn't have written history too far back beyond that. And so they've been with humanity a really long time. What were they about? You know, I know some people would say, oh, they were a manifestation of people's imagination because they were afraid of wolves. That's reasonable. Wolves used to be scary. But how are people still experiencing them if this was always a manifestation of imagination? I don't know.
Without diving into it here, and I know everyone that listens at this point is going to roll their eyes because I say this a lot, I can talk to you off air about that whole topic, because that is 100% the reason I do my show, because just 3 or 4 miles down the road, I had an encounter in 2007 with an upright walking canine. And that is why I want to give people the opportunity to talk about it, because I never felt like I could, because it is insane. I'm a skeptic and I don't believe in that type of stuff, but yet I've seen it. So,
yeah.
But no, that is, I don't like talking about it on here because everyone's like, oh, he just wants to talk about his own stuff all the time. It's like, no, it's literally not. But for somehow it always gets brought back up because I feel like things are connected a lot.
They are. And I've interviewed more than one person who's had a similar experience to you. The one I mentioned earlier was a woman who said it ran up beside her car, crossed in front of her so fast that she didn't even slow down. And I interviewed another woman, and this woman has top secret clearance. She's like, you must never use my name. I could never tell anybody else about this. She's like, because of what I do for a living. She's like, but I saw she said it was either a werewolf or a dog man in broad daylight. And she was pulling over to go into a park, and it walked out, stood in front of her car, looked her in the eye, and then walked away. So, I mean, people are having these experiences.
That's, like I said, I'll talk to you off air about what happened with me, but I had an email a year ago from someone, and I don't know who, because I tried to reply back and said the email didn't exist, so I thought that was strange. But the way it was worded, the person wouldn't give any information out because of how, I don't want to say military, but I got it like a military or like work vibe to it. But the way it was wrote out or whatever, I don't think they were from America, just because the way something was spelled was not like the American way of spelling a word. Like instead of using like, I don't remember what the word was, but I remember it caught my eye. They used an S instead of Z, like say realize, and they had like an S in it. That's like a more of an English.
That's a European, it's a European thing.
Yeah, and they mentioned something about this thing running up to their window, but I'm pretty sure it was like like their driver's window. They said was like this side, which would have been the opposite side of what the driver's window. So it's almost like the car would have been flip flopped from what we were used to. But they said this wolf type creature like stalked them or whatever, and it come running up to the window, and like I think that if I remember right, it was like two of them. But I thought it was just strange, like this email, especially the fact that when I tried to reply back that it didn't exist, I was like, that's even weirder. But no, like there's all sorts of different experiences people have had with these type of things that it's throughout history, like you were saying earlier, like upright walking canines, werewolves, whatever you want to call them, they have a lore that's went back for over thousands of years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I relate Anubis to this, but like the ancient Egyptians had like the jackal-headed Anubis god.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then there's been stories of, I don't remember exactly where it was, but there's an entire tribe of quote unquote dog men
Mm-hmm.
somewhere over there. And then like even Saint Christopher was supposedly depicted in paintings of having a wolf head, which didn't make a whole lot of sense back then either.
Yeah, it's a big part of human history.
So, and then it wasn't the 1700s or whatever, they had the werewolf trials in France where people were getting burned at the stake for being werewolves.
Right.
Like,
well, they were also burning tons of witches at the time too.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there was a lot of fear going around then, and I don't actually think all of that was. I think a lot of that was fear and superstition.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there was actually an epidemic of werewolves or witches.
No.
I think there was an epidemic of superstition.
The guilty were denied. It basically said, no, I'm not a werewolf. Then you were guilty because you denied it. I was like, so what happens if you admitted it? Same thing with like witch. Oh, you're a witch. No, I'm not. Witch is lying. Burn.
Yeah, it was a rough time to be alive back
Right.
then for everybody because you had to live in fear all the time.
Right. We think today is crazy, but look back at those old days. So like, if you believe in the history
terrifying.
of it,
It's terrifying.
It sounds insane.
Yeah.
But, well, is there anything else you'd like to discuss before we wrap this one up?
No, I feel, Brandon, like this was a great conversation.
Yeah, me too. Would you like to let anyone know where they can find you on tours at?
Sure. If you're in Maryland, I work at MarylandHistoryTours.com. It is in Ellicott City, Maryland. And we run ghost tours and history programs from April through December. If you are in Pennsylvania, I have Haunted PA online, and I run ghost tours April through November.
Awesome. Send me that in an email, and then I will include those in the show notes for anyone listening. But I want to say thanks for coming on here and talking with me tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's also been a very enjoyable conversation for me.
And for anyone out there listening, thanks to Rissa, and thanks for listening. But we're going to wrap this one up. So good night, everybody. And that's the show, everyone. I really hope you guys enjoyed the conversations. If you would like to be a guest on Tinfoil Tells, remember to send an email to tinfoiltellspodcast@gmail.com or go to the contact section of tinfoiltells.com. Just get your message to me. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. And just remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.
Tinfoil tales in the headphones. Yeah, it's time to rock. Got a story about a cryptid creature. Let's take a walk. Bigfoot, dogman, they're out there in the dark. But the truth is out there like an alien spark. UFO sightings got the whole world shook. Conspiracies unfold like a story in a book. Media control, trying to keep us blind. But oh, before gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know the secrets they hide, the truth they won't show. Dominate our society, they keep us in chains. But I'm standing tall, it's time to break the reins. to keep us blind, but I won't be fooled, gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know